Hey, I'm Keoki, the CEO at Minikai. On this podcast, you'll hear from industry experts to explore the opportunities, risks, and practical applications at the intersection of AI, disability, and aged care. The aim is to promote a responsible and transparent approach to adoption of AI in a space where safety and trust are really important. Let's jump in. John, good
Hi.
to see you. How are you?
Good to see you too. I'm good, thank you.
Yeah,
it's great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
Yeah.
I'd like to start with you.
Sure.
So, as I understand it, you're a bit of a veteran in the disability sector. Can you I'm always interested to understand how people found themselves in the space. So do you mind sharing how you came to be in the sector and what that kind of transition looked like?
Absolutely. So it was almost entirely by accident. So I came into human services in general because I was really into technology. And I went to university just kind of during the tech bubble, and I thought I was going to be a millionaire in Silicon Valley, as kind of everyone did who was into computers at that time. And that was really exciting time to be in IT. And while I was at university, I started my own business, and I was doing IT consultancy for small businesses in Tasmania, where I'm from. And I started doing some work for some not-for-profit organisations. I did lots of different organisations, and I fell in love with the types of organisations and the work they were doing. And so that's how I made the transition. I ended up getting out of IT and being more interested in the people and the kind of services they were providing. So that's how I got into human services, and I kind of worked in a range of different types of human services for years. I came into disability really as kind of some of the ideas that preceded the NDIS were coming into the public attention when we were talking about things like individualised funding. There was some interesting stuff happening in the UK. And so I came to disability work just as that change was starting to occur, just before the NDIS. And because I'd been in small business and because I'd been interested and studied marketing, I think the whole idea of a market was interesting to me. And so as the NDIS was kicking off, that's really how I started to get really involved in disability. And so now I've been in that space. I'm kind of connected to disability for almost 20 years.
Wow. So does that mean prior to the NDIS you didn't have much experience in the disability sector before the NDIS? No,
so disability was one of the areas the organisation I worked with was in, but I was in a range of different areas. So I wasn't in disability fully. I think it was really the NDIS for me was the trigger to make that my focus.
Gotcha.
Because it was that intersection. So I spent a fair bit of time before disability in community aged care, and then before that in a range of different housing, mental health, different types of services in what at that time was the community services sector.
Yeah. Okay, got it. Yeah. Great. And so I guess maybe casting your mind back to that transition. Do you remember if there were any expectations that you had coming in, and sort of what maybe how those expectations were either sort of met or unmet, having been in the sector now?
So it was a huge time of change, and there was a huge amount of hope. I mean, particularly, the context for the NDIS in Australia was around every Australian counts, at a social movement to try and get proper funding into disability support in Australia. And so there was a huge amount of energy around the idea. And when the NDIS was kind of instituted, it was the success of a social movement to value the lives and the human rights of people with a disability. And I think that was a thing that came with a whole heap of hope, and a lot of that hope was realised with the NDIS. And certainly through the early parts of the NDIS, there were so many people who got access to supports that they didn't get access to before. And I think sometimes the NDIS has become so big, and it's such a big and challenging space. People have lost sight. Some of that great stuff is still happening. The NDIS is a fundamentally good thing. But But I think the other thing was kind of this anticipation for change, the professionalisation of services. So most services at that point in time had either been in government or had been in kind of community services organisations that had existed for a long time. So the creation of a care economy workforce, as we kind of now think of it, was a relatively new idea. So the idea of investing in staff. And the other thing was this kind of idea that you needed a brand, like disability organisations who had previously worked with government to get funding were now going to be in a marketplace. And so all these ideas were coming together at the same time. Huge hope for people with a disability around what new services might mean. Huge changes for the workforce about what it might look like to work differently. And then this kind of massive shift for organisations who went from being, I guess, more focused on doing good or trying to do the best they could with limited resources to being kind of participants in a marketplace that needed to worry about customer feedback and demand and all those kind of things. And I think everyone's actually still adjusting to those things today to various degrees. A lot's happened since then, but people, it's a big shift for a sector.
Maybe this is going to seem like a really obvious question, but I still feel like it's going to be really worth asking your perspective on it. For those who are less familiar, what is the NDIS? What is it?
Yeah, so I mean, yes, it's absolutely, and it's kind of the conversation now that happens in backyards. People don't quite know what it is. So the NDIS stands for the National Disability Insurance Scheme. And kind of the concept of insurance kind of means a couple of things. For a start, it's something that everyone pays into, and that way, if you need it, you know it's there. And so the thing about NDIS that's really important is that it ensures everyone has access to support. And some of the conversations that are happening now are a lot about who gets access. But the underlying premise is that if you need it, it's there. So that's a big part of the NDIS. That was the big change from how disability services were funded before, where not everyone got what they needed. So now it's always there. I think the other idea is that it should be focused on growing people's capability and focused with hope on the future. And so the idea of social kind of insurance or insurance that looks at people's life in terms of their whole life is that you invest in developing capability and capacity so that people can live a good life. And sometimes that's a bit more expensive in the short term, but in the long term it leads to a better life. So the NDIS is a bit about ensuring everyone with a disability has access to supports, but that those supports are focused on their future. And one of the big theories behind the NDIS is that if more people with a disability have the opportunity to participate in the economy and the community, so they're out there, they're working, they're spending money like we all do, that will actually cover the cost of supports for perhaps those people that are unable to participate in that way. And so that economic productivity is what funds the scheme. So that's the dream behind the NDIS, and we haven't quite got it right, but I'm still hopeful we'll work it out. And so really it's a way of people with a disability getting what they need and it focusing on the future. Yeah. That's kind of my elevator pitch for the NDIS.
I love it. Okay, cool. And so if you came into the sector around the time the NDIS was first being implemented, from your point of view, what has changed since then in the sector?
Well, so the NDIS, for a start, there were lots of trials and we tried lots of different things and there were lots of really kind of innovative things that happened. And I think there are some new practices that exist that are really great as a result of the NDIS. So people have thought really differently about how services are provided. One of the big shifts is a lot of services are no longer delivered in a congregate setting, so delivered all together. So there are lots of people with a disability whose experience has been how do we, in the cheapest way possible, keep you safe, and whether you're kind of part of society or not, we're going to focus on kind of keeping you safe and well. And often that was done in settings that were far away from other people or that were kind of up separate for the rest of society. So one of the best things about the NDIS and one of the things that has changed is that people with a disability are much more engaged with the community than they were before. People who need whole whole of life supports, like big supports to keep them safe in every moment, those people are living in the community more often than not. They're not living in institutions, which was a kind of historical solution for people with a disability that didn't mean they led a good life. And people are more involved in work. They're more involved in the community. People with disability have more opportunity to enjoy the same things you and I enjoy in our lives. And that's a fundamentally good thing. And so they're the big shifts that have changed as they relate to people with a disability. I think in terms of disability services, it's also a huge industry now. So much bigger part of the economy, much more front of mind. In it's the kind of thing you talk about at a barbecue in the backyard. I work in the NDIS, and people know what that is, and they understand a little bit about what it's about. So it's become a sector in its own right.
Yeah, definitely. I think the impression that a lot of people have that I've gauged, that they would probably talk about in their backyard is that it's really expensive.
Yeah.
And a lot of people have that impression that it costs a lot. Can you explain how the NDIS works? How does the pricing of it work? And what do you think are some of the causes of it costing so much, or at least there being that impression that it costs a lot?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of elements to that. The first is that the NDIS is a lot more expensive than was anticipated, and that's happened for a couple of reasons. I think one, we've had some pretty big shifts in terms of the workforce. So providing supports is more expensive than it used to be. There's a lot of demand for workforce now. We have relatively low unemployment, and so it's quite different parts of the economy are all competing for workforce, so that makes it a bit more expensive. Certainly in the care economy, so thinking about aged care and healthcare, there's a lot of competition for workers, and so that makes it more expensive. But I think the other part of the NDIS that's been a challenge as it's come to fruition is part of how the NDIS was established was that states contributed some of their existing service delivery to the NDIS, and that created a significant national fund. And there probably wasn't clarity between the states and the federal government, who are responsible for the NDIS, about what was in and what was out. And so we've kind of ended up with this space where the NDIS is responsible for a whole range of things that perhaps weren't intended. And so you've got states who are contributing some money to the scheme. The scheme's getting more expensive, but the states perhaps aren't providing as many services to people with disability as they used to, things that would be part of education, which would be part of housing. And so it's become more expensive, I think, because we're paying attention to it. It's also become more expensive because I think once you create a scheme where people are guaranteed to have support, people are going to look for a way to get on that scheme. And I think there does need to be some careful and very sober discussion about who needs the NDIS scheme, which is meant to be supporting those people who really need support. I think it's got broader than was anticipated. And a lot of the recent legislation changes and the recent government policy changes have been about trying to get those boundaries a bit clearer.
Yeah. I'm going to take a slight digression because I want to come back to the kind of challenges providers faced and things like that.
Sure.
But yeah, you mentioned there that maybe the scope of things that have been supported by the NDIS have been wider than anticipated, or maybe the breadth of things that it can support has led to a larger cost than people may have anticipated. Why do you think that is? Do you think there's a really clear root cause to that? Is it because people's disabilities don't show necessarily, or what's going on there? So
I think there's a range of things that are causing that. For a start, in the original design of the scheme, there was a concept that the scheme would be really for those people who really needed quite significant support. And so there would be other types of support available for people with disability. And those might be kind of specialised supports for people who perhaps don't need customised supports, but just need some help, particularly an intervention during childhood, for example. Yeah. Someone who may have a disability that impacts them in childhood, but with the right therapeutic intervention, they can lead a life without lifelong supports. And I think the challenge has been is that some of those other things that have been in place that support everyone, some of just that more inclusive behaviour of employers generally has become less because the NDIS scheme is there. And you might have heard this term, the only lifeboat in the ocean. This is the idea that I think people see the NDIS as where there is funding available, and so people look to that as the solution. And some of those other community-based solutions, whether it's just everyone in the community being more inclusive of people with a disability, or some of those services, particularly local services that helped people with a disability be included or helped respond to needs in a way that was effective in a local community, have disappeared because you've got individual supports. And those individual supports aren't the solution for everything. And it's where we've got to the crisis with the price too, because the price has become so connected to that idea of individual supports. Yet previously, most supports would have been shared, and how many supports would be available would be based on where the needs were. And so I think as you individualise everything, it does become more expensive.
Yeah. I feel like that's related to the challenges that I see providers face is they're constantly having to negotiate between having really individualised, personalised supports and supporting people with really individualized and complex needs, but then having pressure on them to almost standardize the way in which they report. And so that's it. It's a bit of a dichotomy that they're having to sort of deal with. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the challenge we face in the scheme now is there's significantly more people who need supports than were originally anticipated. There is only a limited amount of money, and Treasury, it's kind of at a national level, has set an expectation that it can't continue to grow. And so we're having a big conversation about how to cut up that money. There's really only two ways to solve that problem. You can either cut it up amongst less people, or you can reduce the cost per kind of item of service delivery. And I think the NDIA, who's responsible for kind of governing the agency, have been trying to manage those things as best they can in context of the legislation. But the reality is that what that has done is led to a downward pressure on the price of disability services in context of a really expensive kind of labour market. And most supports in NDIS involve people. So you've seen downward pressure in the prices. You've seen so many more people need access to the same funding, and so providers are struggling really to provide the right supports for the amount of money that's available per person, either because the amount to fund the service isn't there or because individuals don't have the right amount of funding. I think that the challenge is we're going to have to find a way through that, and it'll be a combination of trying to make services more efficient whilst also responding to the people that need the support. So it's always been a challenge having enough funding. It's now a much more complex challenge than it used to be. More complicated challenge, really.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to ask another obvious question.
Sure.
Because I feel like it's useful for setting the scene. Who are the main stakeholders involved in the NDIS? So who obviously you have those who receive the supports, those who deliver the supports, who funds it, who regulates it, that sort of thing.
Sure. So, I mean, obviously the primary person in the system is the person with a disability. And so as a result of the change and how the NDIS works is that a person with a disability, if they're eligible for the NDIS, gets an NDIS package, and they get that package from the NDIA, the National Disability Insurance Agency. And their role is to support people be assessed for a NDIS package, and if they're eligible for an NDIS package, they support that individual to get access to a package, and then they work with a range of other stakeholders to leverage that NDIS funding. You've got the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission, and they're accountable for making sure that people who provide services to people with a disability do so in a way that is safe and that leads to the best quality services possible. And then you've got a range of other players who support people with a disability navigate the system. So you've got a support coordinator that might help a person with a disability find services, and that's if they have quite complex needs, or you have local area coordinators who play a similar role in terms of coordinating services, but perhaps for people with slightly less complex needs. And then you've got NDIS service providers who provide a range of services. And you mentioned before about providers struggling. It's those providers that directly providing services that are responding to the needs of people with a disability. So they will create services, and they might be disability support, it might be therapy, it might be accommodation, so supported independent living, so home and living type services, and even housing. And all of those organisations receive NDIS funding, but only when a person with a disability chooses to allocate funding from their funding package to those providers. And so it operates like a market, and most of those providers, in fact, including support coordinators, are part of that market. People get to choose which provider they go to.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And focusing on the providers specifically, because we've talked a little bit about maybe the macroeconomic challenges and the cost, but focusing on the providers, what are some of the biggest challenges you see providers facing, and which of those feels most urgent to you?
So I think the first thing is providers are struggling trying to balance two things. And I'll start with registered providers, which is a very large number of providers, but relative to the providers in the NDIS scheme now, a relatively small number. So there are 20-odd thousand registered providers. And I think primarily they're challenged by trying to balance quality and safeguards and outcomes of services, so the quality of the services, with financial sustainability. And that is because certainly the data will tell you, and there's good benchmarking now in disability services, that so services right from small kind of not-for-profit NGOs at $1 million a year, large organisations at $30 million a year, or big national organisations are all struggling with financial sustainability. And they're struggling because of how the scheme is working, and particularly they're concerned about the price of NDIS services, which is regulated by the NDIA. And so I see most of those providers are struggling with the balance between sustainability in a financial sustainability. So how do they make the NDIS funding that's available per service that is delivered work, and they're struggling with that in context of a commitment to quality and to make sure that that service leads to good outcomes. And I think the challenge when you're trying to when there's competition between quality and financial sustainability is some people are getting that right from a quality standpoint but are in financial trouble, and some organisations are getting the finances right but aren't delivering an acceptable quality. And so it's the balance of those two things I see as the main provider challenge. I think the other challenge that's occurring is that you've got now 200,000 unregistered providers, and this was never anticipated in the scheme, that such a large number of people would be providing services who are not registered, so they're not regulated in the same way by the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission. And so I think those providers are struggling with the fact that they're delivering complex services, perhaps without the systems and processes around it. And so we're seeing some quite scary things happening in the space of unregistered providers, and we're seeing people with a disability losing out as a result of either poor quality or sharp practices, so people getting ripped off and fraud. And so I think that in the provider space you're seeing kind of all of that play out, this kind of tension between quality and sustainability, and then huge competition from providers who operate very differently, with very low overheads and often very little safeguards as well.
Yeah, okay. And maybe looking sort of inside the providers, because you obviously are really familiar with how providers operate, having led one yourself. What are some of the primary operational challenges within an organization that is providing disability support?
Yeah. So I think leading large organisations is complex, and most NDIS organisations are suffering from growing pains. And when you grow and when you're in a newly regulated environment, so it's a new scheme, so a new funding environment, there is a relatively new regulator, you're having to try and work out how all your processes line up to that new world. And so I think the challenges are how you organise yourself in context of all those changes. And so organisations having to think about how much investment do I put into training the staff and coaching and quality assurance of what staff are doing day to day. But at the same time, they've also got to think about incident management and risk management, because they're big requirements of the regulatory scheme. And as you've moved towards a regulatory scheme that is much more similar to what you'd see in a commercial setting, you have to bring in different types of skill sets. At the same time, you've got a very complex approach to billing and how you engage and how you get paid. That's become quite complicated in terms of how people get paid for services. These organisations previously mostly received block grants, and so their funding was somewhat stable. And so I think the biggest challenge inside of organisations is trying to work out where you invest in talent, and which talent that you need to retain and which talent you need at different points of time in your evolution, and then the systems and processes to enable that, all while investing in what actually matters, which is the staff on the front line. And so I think, I see the tension of those things play out in organisations, large and small. Do I focus on supervising and training my staff? Do I focus on systems to make sure money's coming in the door? Or do I focus on quality and safeguarding legislation and my obligations and the processes and systems that can demonstrate you're keeping people safe? So the tension between those things is huge. And that's without thinking about the fact that these organisations now have to have websites and advertising and be in a market, which is kind of a new idea too. So I would say it's making tough calls about where you put your energy is the biggest thing happening inside of organisations. I don't think any organisation gets 100% right, and you're constantly having to change that decision because there's not enough resourcing for everything.
Yeah. I think it was something that you and I talked about. You pointed out to me in the really early days of me having just come into the sector that struck me, as this really stayed with me. And you said that a lot of large disability support providers in Australia are kind of like overgrown startups. Yeah. Because they've just had to grow while they're being really responsive to changes that are happening around them.
Absolutely. And that's absolutely true. So because of the structural changes in the NDIS, there has been significant growth. For a start, there are a whole heap of people that weren't getting services that now weren't funded to have services that now have funding to get services. And because unlike some other schemes where government kind of allocates a particular region to one provider, because it's a completely open market, it means some providers have grown really rapidly, and sometimes they're not ready for that. The other thing you've had is that government made a decision to get out of service delivery. So you've had a huge amount of services come from the government sector to the non-government sector, generally to not-for-profit organisations. And so some organisations that were $10, $20 million organisations are now $300-400 million organisations. And that comes with all this change. We have a professional board, and we have we have an IT team, and we have a governance team, and we have a risk team. Whereas previously you might have had a couple of people who wore multiple hats and would be across every issue. So I think that is a big change for these organisations, and they've struggled to keep up with that. And certainly from my experience being inside an organisation, as you grow, you've got to work out where are we going to invest next? What is important for us? And it's always judgment calls, because there's not a huge amount of funding in it when you are large. The larger you are, the more obligations you have. There's a thing called proportional regulation, which means the larger you are, the expectation is you have better safeguards. And so there isn't, as you grow, you've got to constantly work out where you put your energy, where you put your effort.
Oh, lots of challenges.
Lots of challenges, that's true.
Yeah. I think you're pretty familiar with, I guess, some of the potential solutions to solving some of these challenges or addressing some of these challenges. One being technology, which obviously I really want to talk about. But another, which is, I think, a focus you have through your firm Bonorigo, is on mergers and acquisitions.
Yeah.
Can you explain that a little bit? So you've been involved in a number of mergers and acquisitions.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you've got a range of different organisations operating a market that have different skills and different capabilities, mergers and acquisitions present an opportunity to bring together skills. They bring an opportunity to get economy of scale in things that perhaps aren't as impactful to direct service delivery. Like there are certain things that just every organisation has to do. You have to have an IT system. You have to have a finance system, and so sometimes coming together, two small organisations coming together to form a bigger organisation creates that economy of scale. It brings skills together and allows you to deliver better services. And so I've spent a lot of time in my career over the last 10 years particularly focusing on how do you identify organisations that can work well together, where have they got complementary skills and capabilities, and can they operate more sustainably together. And so now in my consulting work, I spend a lot of time working with organisations looking either to develop their capability in that space or who've identified an opportunity and need to assess it and work out whether it's a good fit for them.
Yeah, got it. And I think something that I've noticed is the consolidation of the market.
Absolutely.
Why is that happening? What's driving that?
So a big part of what's driving consolidation is the economic signals that have been coming from the NDIA. So the NDIA, in how they set their pricing, were pretty explicit that they would set funding based on the top 25% of performers in the market. And so what that means is for the other 75%, which is actually the majority of providers in the market, they probably won't be operating sustainably. And so one of the ways to try and solve that problem is through scale, get bigger. As a result of getting bigger, you have more resources. If you can use those resources in a smart way, if you can leverage technology in a smart way, you can operate better. And so that has led to consolidation. I think the other thing that's led to consolidation is government stepping out of service delivery. And so government obviously looking to partner with organisations with a track record of delivery. Organisations have similar systems and processes to government. And so you've seen a lot of services that were previously operated by government be transitioned to what tends to be larger organisations. And so if you look at the growth of, say, the top 10 NDIS organisations in the country by kind of NDIS market share, each of those organisations would have both grown, they would have done some kind of merger activity, and they would have done some kind of transition of government services, either through kind of tendering that happened kind of early in this transition, or more recently there was a wholesale transfer of services, staff and those kind of things. Certainly in New South Wales and Victoria, there was a very significant transition of services from government to the non-government sector.
Okay, that's really interesting. And then I guess as you scale up, you can bring those skills together and access economies of scale in some places where it counts.
Yes.
But I imagine it would also present new challenges or unique challenges with respect to the workforce.
Yes.
Being so large and, often very diverse culturally and linguistically and also geographically.
Yeah.
How would you characterize the unique challenges that relate to the workforce as you kind of get to the larger scale?
I mean, the first thing I'd say is that this is some of these workforces are very large workforces. You're talking about workforces of 5,000, 6,000 people who are being led by a single organisation around the country. And so leading a workforce that, might be in every state is really complex. You need to make sure that there is consistency of practice. You need to make sure there are great lines of communication. You need to make sure systems are working. And I think that's really challenging because for these organisations, you need a mix of two things: the ability to operate in that kind of massive environment, that kind of very large scale, like a Woolworths or a Coles or you think of other large national organisations. You want to kind of have that skill set, but you also need to have this kind of unique disability services expertise. And because those two things are in conflict, I think organisations have struggled to kind of get the balance right between those two things. So it's a big challenge for organisations and made all the more difficult through COVID because, not only did you have kind of these large organisations forming, but you also then had travel restrictions and a whole range of people working from home and a whole range of change, as well as kind of disability support being one of those essential supports that just had to happen. So it's been a difficult time for organisations to focus on what's important when you're working with large workforces, which is how do you culture, practice, systems, really hard things to implement.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's really interesting to think about competition in the context of the disability support sector because obviously, when you're talking about markets and large organizations, you also think about competition. But my impression of the sector is that it's very different from others with respect to competition. It doesn't really feel like providers compete with each other, or maybe they do, but not in the way that you would typically expect from other industries.
Yeah.
Is there competition among NDIS providers, and if so, what is the competition?
Well, it's kind of like cooperation. Like it's half cooperating, half competition, right? And it's partly because I think what joins disability organisations, what joins providers, is a commitment to people with a disability and quality supports and their human rights. And so people don't see the benefit in competing with each other for that. I think we want to share that because we all believe in it. The reality is that you're operating though in a market, and so in a market you need to make sure that you're able to have the right services in the right regions where you operate so that you've got enough funding to have good training and to have good supervision. And so I think at a micro level people compete. Like I think if you take we're in Collingwood right now, I think there'd be a fair bit of competition in Collingwood between providers for individual bits of work. But I think at a kind of a state scale or a national scale, providers work together because they want to share best practice. They want to share. They don't see the quality of the service as what differentiates them, which is really that's the bit that I think is really unusual. Everyone wants the quality of every provider to be good. Whereas in other markets, you have your high quality provider, you have your cheap and cheerful provider, and it hasn't really kind of worked out that way in the disability sector.
Yeah, because quality is a must-have.
Well, equality and safeguarding is a must-have. Yeah. There's kind of legislative obligations you have. There are regulatory things you must meet, and so that's true. But I think also, most people who are leaders in this space are leaders in this space because they want to see the human rights of people with a disability be upheld. And so that's what's driving the kind of the organisational values. The market is kind of also we have to operate in this market and make it work. And that's why you've got such a large number of organisations who are saying they're unsustainable but still trading. And so it means the market signals that normally govern a market don't work. And, you know, it's often when I'm talking to people who are in government or are thinking about this with an economic viewpoint, they say, oh, the market will sort it out. It's like, well, no, because the services are essential. If I want to buy a car and I can't find one for the price I'm willing to pay, I just don't buy a car. You can't say the same thing for services that might keep you safe or in some cases keep you alive or help you get a job. You have to have those things. So it isn't really a market. And I think that kind of creates this weird kind of competition thing that's kind of competition but kind of not. Because, you know, certainly when if I'm leading a service, even if I'm not the right solution, I want to make sure that every person with a disability can find a service that meets their needs. Even if they don't choose me, I want to make sure they have someone providing those supports.
Yeah. That's really well said, John. Yeah, and I think if I think of the role that a provider has in looking after the people that it supports, when you have to do that for many individuals, you almost have to do something that's really unscalable at scale. And we've talked about a lot of the challenges around that. But I wonder what role technology has to play in that. And I know the term digital transformation is kind of thrown around quite a lot, but in the context of a disability support provider, what does digital transformation actually mean, and how do you make that happen? What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, so I chair a digital transformation thought leadership group in the disability sector. So I've kind of had to kind of wrestle with this with a bunch of other kind of leaders in this space. Digital transformation means leveraging technology for better outcomes, and they could be better outcomes in terms of an organisation's sustainability. So it might be efficiency. It might be in terms of the quality of the services, so leading to better outcomes. Or it might actually be digital transformation in terms of the way you provide services. And we've not seen as much of that perhaps in the disability sector as we've expected, but it might be services that are digital. And so disability, if I think of the disability sector, digital transformation is using technology to make the NDIS work for people with a disability so that they live a better life. If that means providers are more efficient so they can invest more of their money on quality, that's great. If it leads to better quality, that's great. But if it leads to new services that perhaps are cheaper in the long run, that would be really fantastic.
Yeah, definitely. And so going to bring in the topic of AI into the conversation.
You know a little bit about that, do you?
It just feels a little bit trite to talk about AI, but I'm obviously focusing on AI in disability support. So very topical. So I guess in the context of a lot of these challenges that providers face and the role that technology has to play, what are some of the big opportunities that you see AI presenting to be able to address some of those challenges?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the first one's the obvious one, and I think it's the one people grasp for immediately is that efficiency. You know, so I think probably the low-hanging fruit and where people tend to go first is kind of how can AI help me do things that I currently do that distract me from what's important? And I think there are some opportunities there. I think it's challenging in the disability space because so much has changed. The way the scheme operates has changed. The way disability organisations work has changed. You know, artificial intelligence, automation is really helpful once you understand how things work. It's a bit harder when there's such a large amount of change. But I think there are opportunities and people are starting to kind of turn their minds to that. I think the second thing, and where I think it can play a really leading role, is thinking about the significant amount of kind of data and information that we have in providing human services and how we can identify opportunities to pick up risks sooner, to identify things that trends or things that might be indicating something's going wrong to safeguard and to improve quality. I think that's a significant opportunity for AI in human services, in disability specifically, because we do collect a lot of data as we're doing our work, and I think to deliver good services, you need to be paying attention to a lot of different things. And I think technology can help us, we can't have it replace the role of judgment in looking at important data, but what we can do is help it draw attention to things that are really important. And I think the last way is actually in service delivery. I think there are significant opportunities in services for people with a disability where artificial intelligence technology could support them to be more independent, particularly support them to learn and have access to more services that develop capability and potentially also manage risks and identify risks in situations where it's not practical or not desirable to have a support worker there the whole time. We're currently very reliant in disability services with the idea that a person needs to be there as the source of support or to develop capability or to safeguard. And I think the real opportunity is where some of this technology can be used safely. We need to be very, very careful with how we roll it out. But if it can replace a person with a disability being so dependent on another person in their life the whole time, and they choose that, then that could be a really good thing.
Yeah. And I guess on the theme of efficiency for an organization, being able to save time, where in an organization's operations do you see the potential for AI to kind of save the most amount of time, and how would you best redirect that time if you could?
So I think the first thing I'd say about, because so many disability services are in the provision of individual supports that involve a support worker, people kind of tend to go to the front line and think about that. I think the challenge with how services operate is that is a quality improvement. If you can reduce the amount of time people on the front line are spending doing things that are not related to administration or record keeping or other things like that, that money can go into quality. So it's not necessarily efficiency for financial savings, it's efficiency for quality, and I think that's a good thing. I think if you think about the back office, the kind of things that every organisation needs to have, I think there are lots of opportunities to implement AI. And actually, as a sector, we're perhaps not as innovative as other sectors in terms of doing things that just everyone needs to do, like paying invoices and, moving paper around and integrating systems. Like, there's heaps of things AI can help there. But I think where it's most interesting is to think about those kind of the what you might call the front office or the middle office, those roles who are involved in overseeing, supporting, coaching that disability support. Those people are firefighters and gatekeepers. They're constantly looking around trying to solve challenges in terms of delivering support. They might be trying to organise the location of people in different places. Technology can help with that. They might be having to consume a huge amount of data and look for patterns that might indicate risk, and AI can help with that. So I think if we could use technology to get people who are supervising services to be able to spend more time coaching staff, that would be a fantastic thing.
One thing that I think is really exciting is if you frame AI as an assistive technology, and an assistive technology that can help with translation of information, then the opportunity that presents is making information more accessible to a diverse workforce.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and almost being able to build quality into the way people consume the information within an organization. So that's definitely something I see as like a big opportunity. But obviously when you adopt any new technology, it presents new risks, especially when it is influencing decision making. And so what do you think are the kind of key risks that providers should be aware of when adopting AI?
So I think the two primary risks are privacy, and that is because the thing that's exciting about AI is joining all your data together and being able to find new insights and be able to automate the way things connect together, so that you can do things more efficiently, effectively, and identify new things. I think the cost associated with that is that all the data therefore is connected together, and you've got a potential safety risk, and you've also got a consent issue around whether people want to share that information. So I think that's a big thing to tackle. I think part of that is a bit about dignity of risk. I think if the benefit of that data being connected together is for the person with a disability and the quality of their services, people will be okay with that. I think if the benefit is efficiency or something else, people won't be okay to that. So it's about the value proposition. I think you can say with privacy, it's a risk, but it's a risk that can be managed. I think the other one is this thing about AI replacing judgment. Ultimately, a lot of disability services, and particularly services for people with more significant disability, is about supporting decision-making. And I think there will be a risk that exists that we can replace quality-supported decision-making with technology that might seem good enough. And I think the risk with that is that we create new risks, that technology is supporting people to make unsafe decisions. And I think that's a big one for providers to wrestle with. I mean, there's all the governance and all the other things that everyone's talking about in AI, but I think particularly for people with disability, it is the right for people with a disability to have control of their privacy and their data, and that risk that the support that is essential for good decision-making for people who need support for decision-making is automated in a way that creates new risk, creates safety risks for those people.
No, definitely. And there's also concern about algorithmic decision-making within the NDIA as well.
Sure.
Around helping to generate plans and things like that.
Yeah, look, there's a lot. It's in the media right now, and there's a lot of discussion around this. And I think that the fact that the discussion's happening is really important. I think there may be some oversimplification of some of these ideas. The current trajectory on assessments, which is what's being discussed right now, is that people to enter the NDIS will get an assessment. That assessment will be tied together with some computer technology that will kind of consider that assessment in context of a whole range of other people with a disability and identify what might be a fair and reasonable amount of funding to offer. And I think people are really concerned about the systemic bias, all the things that might exist when a process is automated. But I think the reality is it's probably how it works already, in the sense that right now we're employing people within the NDIA to make assessment decisions. I think ultimately they're being guided by a set of experience and standards and actuarial tables that will give them some information about what might be a reasonable amount of funding. And so that's happening already. I think actually there's an opportunity that this might be actually making it a bit more transparent. I think the concept that it's going to go into a black box is what concerns people. And I think there is an opportunity for government and for the NDIA to say, well, no, it's actually a bit more about consistency than it is about AI making a decision. It's like we were talking about before. We'd be concerned if we're substituting good decision-making with technology that is creative in its decision-making. I think the use of technology they're proposing is more about predictability, and I think some people will be nervous about that. It is up to government to demonstrate how it is predictable and fair.
Yeah.
And I hope the conversation goes in a way that people can be open to hear that argument. In the NDIS world, we are very emotive. And, the NDIS scheme came from a fight for the rights of people with disability. And I don't want anyone to lose that passion, and I certainly don't want people with a disability to get lost in kind of a political argument about funding. But at the same time, there is a limited amount of funding available. We have to make tough decisions about how we split it up. And if technology can help do that, as long as it's done transparently, I think I can be okay with that. I think we need to have the conversation and be open to hearing both sides of the story. It is always the conversation that leads to the right outcome. There was a previous time government looked to bring in independent assessments, and I was very much against it at this time, and I've said since on social media, with this current change to independent assessments, I think we do need independent assessments. We do need some predictability. I think we need to do the work to ensure people feel it's fair. And if there is bias or if there is concern about that, we need to address it.
Well said. Yeah. Okay, and so maybe looking forward, if you were advising a provider who is just getting started on their AI journey, what would you say to them about where they should start? Like, what's the first step for them?
Oh, that's a tough one in a world of in the world. So I think you've got to start with balance, and I would look to balance two things. The first is you need to have a framework of safeguards around it. You can't just go off and play. You need to make sure some of those important things are considered. But then once you've done that, then you need to create an environment where people can experiment. So you need the rigidness of sound policy and procedure to make sure that it can be done safely, it can be done well, and that people with disability are safe through use of AI. But then you need creativity, and for people to be really intuitive about the way that technology can help them. I know in terms of AI just being available generally to the population, people are finding all kinds of ways to use it. We want to kind of get the benefit of creativity in the use of technology, but have the safeguards too. So it's the balance of those two things is what I think people need to have. Some of the most interesting things that have happened is when people use technology creatively, I think.
Do you see any common misconceptions about what is possible with AI now that you'd like to clear up?
So I think, yes. I think the first thing I'd say is a lot more is possible than what you might kind of consume, what you might understand as a consumer. AI is a skill, and there are organisations that can deliver solutions. And don't assume that what you need to do is just buy a whole load of technology and let people play with technology that consumers have available too. Like sometimes you're better off finding a partner and being quite deliberate about what you want to invest in. So I think one of the misconceptions is that AI is just ChatGPT that you've kind of logged into and had to play with, and that's what it is. There is so much that's in the group of technologies that is AI, that is possible, that is kind of beyond what you might normally think. So I'd clear that misconception up. I think the other one is almost at the opposite end. Like there are some limitations, and I think people kind of almost need to, you need to be kind of hopeful about what it can do, but accept some of the limitations of what it can't. I think the risk might be people might go to the other extreme and say, right, we can just replace disability support workers with a ChatGPT agent, and actually we just need to virtualise all service delivery. And so it's in the extremes. Like it's nowhere near as simple as you think. So you need some skills and to invest in learning more, but it's not foolproof either. Yeah. And so you can't just assume it's going to solve every problem.
Yeah. And there's all of these I guess, nuances and challenges to navigate, but also heaps of opportunity. And so, 5 years from now, what's your kind of best prediction for what the use of AI looks like in the disability space?
So I have two predictions. I think One is that you will see AI be used in the disability sector in the same way it's empowering a range of other sectors. I think there will be some great automation. Things will be more efficient. We'll be able to spend more time on what's more important as a result of using that technology. But the other hope I have is that people get to play and be creative with it and really look to invent some solutions that we haven't even thought of yet. I hope in 5 years that people are using adaptive reality technology to support people with more significant disabilities to learn how to do things they wouldn't otherwise be able to do independently. Just being able to make a sandwich or boil the kettle or make the bed for people with more significant disabilities is a barrier. And currently our main solution is support workers. And so can the technology support people to learn more skills? I hope in 5 years we're seeing AI technology used to develop the capability of people with a disability. I think that would be really good, and I think that's possible. There's some great technology out. I've been trying to work out when I might kind of bring these little glasses out, right? So these are AR glasses. They connect to a little phone. I told Keoki I was going to do this beforehand. They have cameras on them that can see what's going on. I think it will be possible in the next 12 months, let alone next 5 years, to be able to create adaptive reality experiences for people with a disability to help guide and prompt people, particularly people with an intellectual disability or a sensory disability, to be able to do things they can't currently do independently. And so if I think of the technology is the ability for people to be more independent, which is really the kind of the desire, the dream of the NDIS. I think you could use kind of AI and adaptive reality and glasses to be able to do that kind of stuff. It's light. It's kind of, it's consumer technology. I bought this off the internet. Like anyone can get access to this. Some of what we need is just people playing around with this stuff to see what they do. And they need expertise in disability. So we need people in the disability sector to be playing with this kind of technology.
Yeah, awesome. Can I ask one more? Got time for one more question?
Yep.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so my last question for you is, if you cast your mind back to the time that you were entering the sector, knowing what you know now, what advice would you give to that John?
Pay more attention to the core practices of disability services. One of the things that hasn't changed in the last 20 years that I've been in disability services is some of the key ideas that people got taught when they first started as a support worker 20 years ago. And some of those mindsets still inform how I think about delivering services as a disability leader. So pay attention to your Cert 3 teacher and the concepts that they're teaching you about human rights, about active support, about those kind of things, because they still inform best practice today.
Cool. Well, yeah, thanks, John. Thanks for joining me in this conversation. It's been, a real pleasure.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks for having me.